Before werewolves, there were shapeshifters, beasts that could shed their human skin and walk among us. These ancient creatures weren't cursed men, they were primal predators, born of an ancient magic. Long before silver bullets and full moons, Europe trembled at their hunger. This is the savage truth behind Europe's oldest shapeshifters, the monsters who still haunt the darkest corners of history. And it all started in the heart of Europe's untamed forests. In the dense, mist-covered forests of Eastern Europe, long before the legends of werewolves took root, there existed a far older, darker fear. It was in the 12th century, near the Carpathian Mountains, that the first whispers began. Whispers of men who could transform into monstrous beasts, terrorizing villages and hunting under the cover of night. The stories were passed from one fearful villager to the next, but it wasn't until a string of grisly events unfolded that the true horror of the shapeshifters was revealed. One chilling night, a village near the forest's edge awoke to an unimaginable sight. The graves of their loved ones had been torn open, the earth ripped apart as if by some great force. Bodies that had been buried for years were found face down in the soil, their features twisted in grotesque expressions of terror. No one could explain how or why this had happened, but the fear was immediate and overwhelming. The villagers gathered in the square, murmuring in hushed tones about what they had seen. Some claimed that the dead had risen. Others whispered of dark magic, of men who could become beasts, cursed by ancient forces. In the days that followed, strange sightings became more frequent. Livestock were slaughtered in the fields, their bodies torn apart with unnatural force, as though something far stronger than any human or animal had stalked the land. The villagers could no longer dismiss these occurrences as simple tragedy or accident. This was something darker, something older. It was during this time that a group of hunters from the village, desperate to protect their families, ventured deep into the forest. They returned days later, their faces pale with terror, each man too shaken to speak of what they had seen. When they finally found their voices, they spoke of a shadowy figure, half man, half beast, stalking the woods, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. They had followed it, but the creature had turned on them, moving with unnatural speed and strength, leaving only a trail of broken trees and blood in its wake. The hunters fled, barely escaping with their lives. As the weeks passed, the fear grew. People spoke in whispers, exchanging tales of the creatures that walked the earth in human form, only to reveal their true selves when the full moon rose. These shapeshifters, some said, were the first of their kind, beings born from an ancient magic that connected man and beast. They were both feared and revered, for they held the power to control the animals of the forest, to turn into creatures of nightmare, and to take the very lives of those who crossed their path. But as the stories spread, something else began to stir beneath the surface. Long before the shapeshifters emerged from the shadows of the Carpathian Mountains, ancient beliefs had already begun to weave their way into the fabric of European folklore. In villages scattered across the dense forests, the people held reverence for the natural world, worshipping gods who ruled over both man and beast. These gods were seen as protectors, but also as powerful forces that could easily slip from benevolence into rage. Among them were deities like Cernunnos, the horned god of fertility and animals, who was believed to walk the earth in the form of a man with the antlers of a stag. It was a world in which the boundaries between man and animal were often blurred, and the supernatural was never far from the living. For centuries, the people lived with a sense of false comfort, believing that the line between the human world and the wild was sacred and unbreakable. Every year, the villagers would gather in candlelit circles, performing rituals meant to honor the spirits of the forest. These ceremonies, held under the glow of the full moon, were meant to ensure the protection of the harvest, the safety of their animals, and the prosperity of their land. The scent of burning incense and the soft rustle of ancient chants filled the air as families gathered around the sacred fires, offering gifts of grain, milk, and honey to the gods they believed watched over them. But as the years passed, the rituals began to take on a more ominous tone. The villagers noticed changes in the air, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the forest even during the warmest nights. Whispers in the dark spoke of ancient forces that were waking, disturbed by the growing encroachment of humanity into the wilds. The gods, once seen as protectors, were now seen as guardians of a dark and primal power, one that demanded respect and sacrifice. One evening, during a particularly cold and misty autumn, an elderly priestess led the village in a sacred ritual to honor the forest gods. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood as they stood in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The fire flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the circle. The priestess, draped in furs and ancient symbols, held up a blade and began chanting in a language so old the villagers could barely understand. As she made the offering, the wind picked up, howling through the trees as though answering her call. The flames seemed to dance wildly, casting strange, twisting shapes on the forest floor. The villagers, uneasy but bound by tradition, stood in silence. But as the ritual reached its peak, something shifted in the air, something darker, more malevolent. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, and the whispers in the wind grew louder, almost like voices. Some of the villagers claimed to hear growls, low and guttural, drifting in from the woods. Others spoke of seeing shadows, figures that moved too swiftly, too silently to be human. The priestess, with her eyes fixed on the fire, whispered something under her breath, a prayer for protection that none dared to question. As the ceremony ended, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The villagers returned to their homes, but the ritual had not brought the comfort it once did. Instead, it seemed to stir something deep in the earth, something ancient and hungry. But what they didn't know was that the true horror was not in what they had awakened. It was in what had always been there, waiting, watching, and now, perhaps, ready to reclaim its dominance over the land. The first signs that something was wrong came in the dead of winter, when the air was thick with fog and the forest seemed to swallow the light. The village, once bustling with life, became eerily quiet as a sense of dread settled over the land. At first it was subtle, a flicker of unease, barely noticeable, like the rustling of leaves in an empty clearing. But then, strange occurrences began. It started with the livestock. One by one, the animals began to fall ill. Cattle, sheep, and goats were found dead in the fields, their bodies mutilated in ways that could not be explained. The wounds were unlike anything the villagers had ever seen, deep gashes, as though torn by claws far too large for any predator. Their eyes, wide with terror, seemed to gaze at something far beyond the fields, as if they had seen something too horrible to comprehend before their last breath. The farmers could only stand in shock, unsure of what had caused the carnage. The village was shaken, but it was only the beginning. Then, strange marks began to appear on the bodies of those who had been closest to the forest. It started with a farmer named Juris, who found a deep claw-like scratch across his chest one morning, though he had no recollection of being attacked. At first, it was dismissed as an accident, a stray branch from the dense woods, but the wounds seemed to deepen as time passed, never healing, always raw. Soon after, other villagers began reporting similar marks, scratches that appeared overnight, deep and jagged, like the work of something alive. Yet, there was no sign of a struggle, no animal prints, and no clear explanation. The first true sign of something unnatural came when the local midwife, an older woman named Iska, delivered a child that was unlike any the village had ever seen. The baby, born under the shadow of the full moon, had an unsettling appearance. Its eyes were an unnatural shade of yellow, like that of a wolf, and its fingers, though small, were tipped with claws. The child's cries were harsh, primal, sending a chill through anyone who heard them. But what terrified the villagers most was the way the child reacted to the light. It hissed and recoiled, its body contorting in ways no normal baby should be able to. When the priest was summoned to bless the child, he could barely touch it, as if some unseen force kept him at bay. The child's parents, once filled with joy, soon began to whisper in fear. They could see the changes in their baby, its violent, restless movements, its unnatural strength. It was not a child of the gods they feared, it was something else. Something marked by the dark magic that had begun to stir in their land. Rumors spread quickly, and fear grew like wildfire. The villagers started to believe that the markings, the strange births, and the sickness were signs of a curse that had been unleashed by the very rituals they had once believed would protect them. They whispered that those who were marked by these signs were no longer human. Something else had claimed them, something older, something far darker. Then came the sickness. At first it was only a few people, coughing, shivering, pale as death. But it spread quickly, and soon the entire village was gripped by a fever so intense it left its victims weak, delirious, and coughing up blood. The priest claimed it was a punishment from the gods, a result of disturbing the ancient powers of the forest. But others, more fearful, claimed it was the Shapeshifters' curse, the very same creatures that had lurked in the shadows for centuries, now reawakening to reclaim the land. In the dead of night, the villagers began to question each other. Who among them was marked? Who was truly human? And who had already fallen to the curse? They watched their neighbors with suspicion, and even the slightest odd behavior became a cause for concern. Those who were once friendly now turned cold, eyeing each other with distrust. No one was safe. That was only the first crack in the story. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the village, once a tight-knit community, began to unravel. The sense of dread that had settled over the land became almost palpable, thick in the air like a fog that no amount of fire or light could chase away. The people could feel it now. The fear was no longer just a whisper in the dark. It had become a part of their daily lives, clinging to them, making every breath, every step, a reminder that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the livestock anymore. The deaths had continued, and now the crops were failing too. Fields that had once yielded bountiful harvests now stood barren. The plants withered, their leaves shriveled and brown. Farmers who had toiled under the same sun for years watched helplessly as the land rejected them, as though the very earth itself was dying. It wasn't a simple drought, nor an explanation that could be chalked up to bad weather. The land itself seemed cursed, poisoned by some unseen force that had its grip on everything. The crops, like the animals, were withering in unnatural silence. Whispers spread that the curse wasn't just a sickness or a bad omen. It was something far darker. Some began to speak openly about the Shapeshifters, about the ancient magic that had been disturbed by the villagers' rituals. They said the creatures had been awakened from their slumber, their power growing stronger with every passing day as the earth itself turned against the people. But the true fear came when the shadows began to move at night. The once peaceful village was now haunted by a presence, something just beyond the reach of the firelight, lurking in the dark corners of the fields and the forests. People began to see shapes moving between the trees, figures too large to be animals, too fast to be human. Livestock would disappear without a trace, their bodies never found, and the sounds of low growls and howls echoed through the forest, too close to be ignored. It was no longer just a fear that lived in their minds. It was a fear that walked the earth with them, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Neighbors began to accuse one another, pointing fingers at those who seemed to be suffering the most. The sickness, the strange behavior, the disappearances, all became reasons to suspect betrayal or worse, that one among them had already fallen to the curse. The once lively community now turned inward, eyes narrowed, voices hushed. No one trusted anyone anymore. It was as if the curse itself had seeped into their very souls, spreading distrust and paranoia like a sickness of its own. The accusations were wild at first, unfounded, but the fear made them seem real. One evening, a woman named Inga, who had been known for her devotion to the old ways, was found standing at the edge of the village, staring into the forest. She'd been acting strangely for weeks, muttering to herself and avoiding others. The villagers, frightened and desperate, accused her of being a shapeshifter, a creature hiding in plain sight, watching them from within. They dragged her to the village square and demanded answers, but Inga only smiled, a twisted, knowing grin that sent shivers down their spines, and said nothing. That night, she vanished. No one knew where she had gone, but her disappearance only fueled the growing paranoia. Some believed she had transformed into one of the beasts, while others whispered that she had been taken by the creatures, claimed by the curse they had unleashed. Either way, the fear of the unknown spread like wildfire, and the villagers began to wonder who would be next. The tension escalated with each passing day. The people, once bound together by their shared labor and simple lives, were now divided. They couldn't escape the growing dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig outside their windows felt like a warning A creature was stalking them, and they didn't know how to stop it. The wild men, the shapeshifters, had not just come from the forest, they were among them, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment to strike. And from there, everything grew darker. As the fear continued to tighten its grip on the village, the people turned to desperate measures, clutching at anything they believed might offer protection. They knew they could not fight the shapeshifters with swords or arrows. They were fighting something far older, something that defied their understanding. The rituals, once thought to be ancient superstitions, were now their last hope. They began with garlic, an age-old remedy against evil. Cloves of garlic were hung above doorways and windows, hoping to keep whatever force was hunting them at bay. Salt, too, was scattered around homes and fields, forming protective barriers against the creatures that roamed the dark. The scent of garlic hung heavy in the air, mixed with the stench of fear that clung to the villagers like a second skin. But these measures were barely enough to calm their nerves, let alone offer real protection. The people knew that the shapeshifters were not merely warded off by herbs or salt. They had already seen too much, their lives now shadowed by the creatures that stalked the land. Desperation set in, and the villagers turned to older, more dangerous rituals. The full moon, which had once been a time of simple celebration, was now viewed with trepidation. The villagers would gather in secret, far from the prying eyes of those who had not yet fallen to the curse. These sacred nights were filled with whispered incantations, blood offerings, and the light of flickering candles. The rituals, drawn from forgotten texts and ancient lore, were meant to invoke the protection of gods long buried by time. They believed that by channeling the power of these deities, they could drive the shapeshifters back into the darkness from which they came. But the fear was too great. The rituals felt like an act of desperation, not salvation. The more they performed the ceremonies, the more they realized that nothing they did seemed to stop the horrors. The livestock continued to die, the strange marks continued to appear on the villagers' skin, and the strange howls of beasts echoed through the trees. It was as if the shapeshifters were growing stronger, feeding off their fear. The villagers' actions grew more frantic. Every night, they burned more incense, performed more rituals, and offered up more sacrifices, hoping the ancient magic would keep them safe. But nothing changed. If anything, the terror intensified. In their desperation, some of the villagers turned to darker paths. A few whispered of a forbidden ritual, one that would supposedly allow them to communicate directly with the spirits that had been disturbed by the shapeshifters. This dark magic, they believed, would reveal the source of the curse and allow them to finally destroy it. But these were not rituals meant for the living. They were meant for those who had already passed, those who had crossed into the other side. A group of brave, or perhaps foolish, villagers gathered under the cover of night to perform the forbidden ritual. They believed it was their only hope, that they could gain the knowledge they needed to end the curse once and for all. But as they recited the ancient words, a cold wind swept through the village, extinguishing the flames of their candles. In the darkness, they heard it, a low growl, too close, too real. That moment opened a door that should have stayed closed. As the days wore on, the village was consumed by a terror unlike any they had ever known. The shapeshifters were not merely creatures of flesh and blood. They were manifestations of an ancient curse, and death itself seemed to have lost its power. Those who died under the shadow of the shapeshifters were not at peace. Their deaths were tragic, violent, and unnatural, and the fear that followed was even worse. The villagers had always believed that death marked the end of suffering, the end of terror. But as more and more of their people were killed by the beasts, something began to change. Bodies, once thought to be resting in peace, were exhumed, defiled, and twisted into horrific forms. The once sacred burial rites that were meant to ensure eternal rest now seemed futile in the face of the growing curse. One by one, the dead were disturbed, their graves opened by forces beyond the living's understanding. In response, the villagers turned to ancient burial rituals, hoping to ensure that the dead would stay where they belonged. Stones were placed over the bodies, great heavy stones meant to pin the dead to their graves and keep them from rising. Nails were driven through the palms and feet of the deceased, securing their bodies to the earth. For those believed to be cursed or marked by the shapeshifters, stakes were driven through their hearts to prevent them from rising. These measures were not just superstition, they were born of a desperate need to control what they could no longer understand. But despite these attempts to keep the dead at rest, something more terrifying began to unfold. Bodies that had been buried with the utmost care were found disturbed, their graves emptied as if the earth itself had rejected them. The villagers no longer saw death as an escape. For the first time, they realized that death was no guarantee of peace. It had become another form of terror. The priest, once a man of great faith, began to notice the signs. During his midnight vigils, he would hear noises coming from the graveyard, scratching at the earth, whispers that echoed through the darkness, too faint to understand but too real to ignore. It was as though the spirits of the dead had not found rest, but had instead been trapped, twisted by some unnatural force. The fear among the villagers deepened. They began to question their burial practices, wondering if they had done enough to ensure the dead remained where they belonged. Had they done enough to prevent the shapeshifters from rising again? The lines between life and death had become blurred. Too many had died too violently, and something deep in the earth seemed to stir. Some believed that the shapeshifters were not merely creatures of flesh, but were the embodiment of death itself, reclaiming what it had lost. It wasn't just the living who were suffering, it was the dead, too. And the worst fear of all, that the dead might still be alive, still walking among them, waiting for the right moment to strike, because some of the dead refused to stay buried. As the village slept one night, the ground itself trembled, as if something beneath it had awoken. The moonlight cast long shadows over the burial grounds, and then, from the deepest part of the earth, something stirred. It rose, not as a man, but as something far worse, its form shifting, a grotesque mixture of beast and corpse, its eyes burning with a hunger that could never be satisfied. The creature, no longer bound by death, was free, flesh torn, bones broken, yet alive in a way that defied nature. And some say, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear its footsteps echoing through the trees, slow, deliberate, waiting for the next soul to claim, because what they buried was never meant to stay underground.